I heard my son tell the funeral director, "Just keep it cheap. She doesn't need anything fancy." And something inside me went cold in a way grief alone could never explain. My husband's body was lying in the next room, still and cooling, and my boy, my only child, couldn't even be bothered to lower his voice. As if I weren't standing right there, as if my ears had aged along with my bones and grown too brittle to catch his words. But I heard every syllable. At 76, hearing is the one thing life hasn't managed to dull. The director looked at me then, him in his polished shoes and practiced sympathy, and I saw the hesitation in his eyes, the quiet little question. "Is this really what you want, ma'am?" But my son answered for me before the man could speak. "Simple casket, simple service," he said. "My mother isn't particular." Not particular. That's what he thinks of me. Or perhaps it's what he needs to think of me so his conscience can sleep at night. I stood very still, my hands wrapped around the handle of my old purse, the one my husband bought me back when a gift from him still felt like a promise. I could smell the cold air seeping in from the hallway where they kept the bodies. Even that felt more respectful than my son's tone. "David," I said quietly, "your father deserves dignity." He exhaled sharply through his nose, the way men do when patience runs thin. "Mom, funerals are expensive, and we need to be practical. You don't need to worry about appearances." Appearances? He said it as if honoring a man's life were nothing more than vanity. The funeral director cleared his throat. "Mrs. Moore, perhaps you'd like to sit down while we go over the—" "No," my son cut him off. "I'll handle it." And just like that, I was dismissed, pushed aside, reduced to a frail widow who shouldn't meddle in grown-up matters. I looked at my son, the same boy who once cried when he scraped his knee, who used to climb into my lap with grass in his hair and dirt on his nose. 43 years old now, wearing a suit too expensive for the humility he lacked. His father used to say tenderness was something a man learned, not inherited. Perhaps I should have listened more carefully to the warning buried in that sentence. The director gestured toward his office, and David followed him, already discussing modest options, as if he were planning the disposal of old furniture, rather than burying the man who raised him. I remained in the hallway, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly above me. My husband's door was half open. I couldn't see his face, just the outline of his shoulder beneath the sheet. I stepped inside. The air was colder there, or maybe it was just me. I rested my fingers on the edge of the gurney, feeling the chill through the metal. "I'm here," I whispered, "even if he isn't." The silence pressed against me, but it didn't frighten me. Silence and I have known each other a long time. When I walked back into the hallway, I heard David laughing softly with the director about some cost-efficient package. He had never laughed like that with his father, not in years. I straightened my spine, though it ached. "Bill it to me," I said. David turned, startled. "Mom?" "Bill everything to me," I repeated, and my voice, thin but steady, felt like it belonged to someone I had forgotten I once was. The director nodded slowly. I walked past my son before he could protest, my steps small but deliberate. Grief weighed on my shoulders, but something else moved beneath it, something firmer, older, long neglected. Outside, the wind scraped at my cheeks. Across the street stood a narrow brick building with boarded-up windows, the one my husband used to say would make a fine workshop someday. I hadn't thought of that in years, but loss rearranges the mind. It clears a path where one didn't exist, And as I looked at that abandoned building, something inside me that had been silent for decades stirred awake, stretching like a creature stepping out of hibernation. I didn't know yet what I was going to do, but I knew this much. My son's words would not be the final chapter of my life. When I stepped outside the funeral home, the cold air felt sharper than it should have. Grief alone doesn't change the weather, but it changes the way the world touches you. My husband used to say that life gets heavier in increments, ounce by ounce, moment by moment, until one day you wake up and realize you can barely lift yourself. I think I reached that realization walking across that parking lot. A woman my age moves slowly, but that day I felt something different in my steps. Not the frailty I'd grown used to, something steadier. As if my body understood before my mind did that the ground beneath me had shifted. David came out behind me, his shoes clicking briskly on the pavement. He always walked as if the earth belonged to him. "Mom, you didn't have to embarrass me back there," he said. "It was just a misunderstanding." A misunderstanding. Children use that word when they want to soften their cruelty with something that sounds reasonable. "I wasn't embarrassed," I said. "I simply corrected you." He sighed, exasperated. "You don't know what things cost these days. I was trying to help." Help? Another word that sounds polite until you scrape the varnish off it. "I've been burying people longer than you've been alive," I murmured. "I know what dignity costs." He opened his mouth again, ready to lecture me, but a line of cars pulled in and he adjusted his tie, suddenly preoccupied with the image he presented to strangers. That was my son, willing to bruise his mother behind closed doors but desperate to seem polished when others were near. We stood by my old sedan. He glanced at it with that faint wrinkle of distaste he never bothered to hide. "You really should think about getting something newer," he said. "Reliable." "Reliable?" I repeated. "Like family?" He ignored the jab, or pretended to. "I'll call tonight. We need to finalize things. Don't agree to anything without running it by me first." "I already told the director to bill me." "Yes, well," he cleared his throat. "We'll discuss it." We wouldn't. I knew that the way I know the taste of my own breath. David never discussed anything. He decided, informed, and expected gratitude. He tapped the roof of my car lightly, as if signaling the end of a meeting, and walked away before I could say goodbye. I watched him leave, small plumes of breath escaping his mouth, rising and fading in the winter air. I used to love watching him walk when he was little. Back then, his body still carried traces of softness, of boyhood. Now, every step felt like a performance. I sat in the driver's seat and closed my eyes. The steering wheel was cold beneath my palms. For a moment, I let myself imagine my husband sitting beside me, his hand resting over mine, warm and patient the way it always was. He would have told me to breathe, to stand tall, to stop shrinking myself for the comfort of others. On the way home, the town looked unfamiliar despite all the years I'd lived there. Grief does that. But it wasn't only grief. It was something else, something older, like dust shaken loose from the shelves of memory. At a red light, I glanced in the rearview mirror and caught sight of my own face. Not the grandmotherly softness I'd grown used to giving the world, but a firmer line around the mouth, a steadier gaze. I didn't look angry. I didn't even look hurt. I looked awake. When I got home, the house felt too quiet. My husband's jacket still hung on the hook by the door. His boots sat beneath it, laces undone the way he always left them. Those small, careless details of marriage suddenly felt like treasures. I touched the collar of his jacket. It still held the faintest scent of sawdust. I made myself a cup of tea I didn't drink. The cup sat cooling on the table while I stood in the middle of the kitchen, listening to the refrigerator hum. It's strange what loneliness teaches you to notice. David texted in the afternoon. Don't make things complicated. Dad wouldn't want that. Funny how people speak for the dead when it's convenient. I didn't answer. Instead, I walked outside into the yard, the winter grass brittle under my shoes. Across the street, through the bare trees, I could see the roofline of that narrow brick building I'd noticed earlier, the one my husband used to point out on our way to the market. One day, he'd say, I'll make that place mine. He never did. Life got in the way, as it always does when dreams are tucked behind duty. But standing there, watching the outline of that forgotten building against the fading light, I felt a quiet certainty settle into me like a stone placed deliberately in the palm of a hand. Something in my life had been allowed to decay. Not just my marriage, not just my body, but my sense of worth. My son's words hadn't created that rot. They simply revealed it. And for the first time in years, I wondered what might happen if I stopped pretending not to notice. It was late afternoon when I finally sat at the dining table, the same oak surface where my husband and I had eaten thousands of quiet meals. The sunlight came in low through the window, slanting across the wood and catching on the dust I hadn't bothered to wipe away. I don't think I'd ever noticed how still the house could be. A woman spends decades tending to everyone else's noise. When the noise dies, it takes a while to realize the silence isn't just absence, it's space. I pulled the box of documents toward me. My husband kept everything, every receipt, every insurance policy, every warranty card from appliances that had long since broken. He believed in order. I believed in letting things be. Between the two of us, we created a workable system, until now, when I had to navigate it alone. I opened the lid and saw his handwriting on the top folder. Neat, angular, unmistakably his. Something inside me tightened, the kind of ache that doesn't explode but settles deeper. I reached for the folder and sat with it in my lap, letting my thumb trace the ink he'd pressed into the paper. Funny how the smallest marks become precious when the person who made them is gone. David's words were still echoing in my mind. Keep it cheap. My son had reduced a lifetime of work, companionship, and quiet loyalty to a budget line. I suppose people do that now. Take whatever is inconvenient, rename it practicality, and walk away feeling righteous. But sitting there with my husband's handwriting beneath my thumb, something felt wrong. Not just about the funeral, about everything. Inside the folder were lists, meticulously ordered. Home mortgage history, car insurance records, the old will we'd drafted 20 years ago. Beneath that was a thin, weathered envelope I didn't recognize. The paper was soft at the edges, like it had been handled often. I slid it out carefully. Inside was a single sheet, folded 3 times. I unfolded it and stared. It was a drawing, simple, pencil-sketched, almost childish in its proportions. My husband had never been much of an artist, but I knew this drawing. I'd seen versions of it on napkins, in margins of newspapers, on the back of grocery lists. It was the outline of a narrow building with a sign above the door. Moore's Woodworks. My breath caught. He had drawn it again and again over the years, always with slight differences, but always that same shape. And always that building, the one next to the funeral home. He used to point it out to me as we drove past, saying, "If I ever get the chance," and then shrug, because a man working 2 jobs doesn't get chances. He gets obligations. I placed the drawing flat on the table. For a long moment, I simply looked at it. The crooked doorway, the uneven lettering, the faint smudges from where his thumb must have dragged across the graphite. And I realized he'd folded and unfolded it often, maybe dreaming with it in his pocket. "You always wanted this," I whispered into the empty room. My voice didn't echo. It simply disappeared into the air as if the house had absorbed it out of habit. I reached into the box again and found a small notebook. In it were pages of numbers, measurements, cost estimates, scribbles like oak shelving. Ask Helen about lighting. He had been planning, quietly, without telling me, perhaps because he thought it would burden me, or perhaps because dreaming felt safer when it wasn't spoken aloud. I sat back in my chair, the drawing still in front of me. My son's text had arrived an hour earlier, something about choosing the economy package for the service. I hadn't replied. I didn't feel compelled to. My eyes drifted to the window where the dimming light softened the edges of the street. From here, if I leaned a little, I could see the top corner of that building's roof. Just the corner, but enough to know it was real, not just a shape from an old dream. I closed the notebook and rested my hands on the table. They felt steadier than they had in a long time. Not young, not strong, but present. A thought formed slowly, the way dawn seeps into a room, quiet, deliberate, inevitable. If my husband had kept his dream folded close to his heart for so many years, maybe he had been waiting for me to open it. And if I had spent my life bending to make room for others, perhaps it was time, long past time, to consider what I might build for myself. The room felt different when I stood up. Not lighter, exactly, but awake. I gathered the documents carefully, placing the drawing on top, and slid everything back into the box. My hands didn't tremble. There was one more thing I wanted to look at before the day ended. I put on my coat, buttoning it slowly, and walked toward the front door. The air outside was crisp, the first hint of evening settling over the street. My steps were small, but I wasn't moving like a woman drifting through loss. No, my steps had purpose. I crossed the yard, paused at the sidewalk, and turned toward the narrow brick building at the edge of town, the one I had looked at for years without really seeing. This time, I saw it clearly. The building looked smaller up close. Things often do, dreams especially. From the sidewalk, I could see how the bricks had darkened with decades of weather, how ivy had crept up the left side like a slow, determined hand. I stood there for a moment, my breath clouding in the air, feeling strangely like a trespasser in my own life. For so long I had walked past this place without pausing, without imagining it could concern me. But now I found myself unable to step away. The front door was boarded shut, though the wood had warped with time, leaving thin cracks that let a sliver of interior darkness show. I placed my fingertips against the board. The cold passed straight through the grain and into my skin. I could almost picture my husband standing beside me, rubbing his hands together the way he did when he was excited, pretending not to be. A for sale sign hung crookedly from a nail. The edges were curled, the ink faded from sun and rain. It looked forgotten, the way old people feel when the world marches on without them. But I had seen enough forgotten things in my life to know they weren't always finished. Sometimes they were simply waiting. I walked around to the side alley. A small basement window sat low to the ground. The glass was dirty, but not cracked. I crouched slowly, my knees complaining, and tried to peer inside. All I could make out was shadow. Still, the closeness of it, the knowledge that something had stood here all these years untouched, stirred something in me that was not grief, not quite hope either. Something in between. Something with a pulse. A car drove past, and I straightened, brushing dirt from my coat. A woman my age, wrapped in a heavy scarf, glanced at me through her windshield. She must have thought I was lost. In a way, I had been, for a long time, but not right now, not here. I stepped back to the sidewalk and looked up at the narrow roofline, the slight sag where time had pressed down. My husband would have known exactly what repairs were needed. He always had a sense for what could be salvaged. He used to say, "A building is just waiting for the right hands." I suppose I never considered that my hands could be the right ones. I took out my phone. It felt heavier than usual, as if this moment required more strength than the others that had filled my days of late. On the for sale sign, beneath the faded lettering, a number was still visible. Half rubbed away, but readable if you squinted. I dialed. A voice answered on the second ring, cheerful in the way people are when they expect an easy commission. "Yes, this is Martin Properties." "Hello," I said, surprised at the steadiness of my voice. "I'm calling about the brick building on Hampton Road, the one next to the funeral home." "Oh," he said. "That one. Been sitting for years. You looking to rent?" "No." A long pause. "I'd like to see it, and if it suits, I'd like to buy." There was a rustle on the other end, papers shifting, surprise spreading through the silence. "Buy? Well, yes, of course. It's just that we haven't had much interest. I can meet you tomorrow morning if that works." "That works," I said. When I hung up, the wind moved through the street, carrying a faint smell of pine from somewhere farther down the block. My fingers tingled, not from cold, but from something else. A quiet, growing certainty. I stood there another minute, long enough for the last light to sink behind the rooftops. The building didn't look beautiful. It didn't look promising. It looked tired, worn down, overlooked. Maybe that's why I felt drawn to it. People forget that things with cracks still hold, that age doesn't mean uselessness, that sometimes a structure stays standing through nothing more than stubbornness and memory. I touched the peeling frame once more and turned toward home. I didn't rush. My steps were slow, deliberate, measured. Not the steps of a woman drifting through grief, but of a woman moving toward something she hadn't yet named. Whatever happened next, I knew this much. I was no longer standing on the outside of my life, looking in. By morning, the sky had turned the color of old pewter, low clouds pressing down as if the town itself were exhaling. I woke early, not because I slept well, but because age makes sleep a shallow guest. I brewed tea, though I barely tasted it. My body felt heavy, but my mind had a steadiness I hadn't felt in years. Grief hadn't passed, not even close, but it had been joined by something I could lean against. At 9, my phone buzzed. "David. Mom, I forwarded you the budget for Dad's service. Don't add anything unnecessary." Unnecessary. My husband's life condensed into a spreadsheet. I didn't respond. Instead, I dressed in my warmest coat and set out for my meeting. The sidewalk was still damp from last night's frost, and the air carried that faint, metallic smell winter brings, a smell that made me think of my husband's workshop, his tools chilling overnight, his breath fogging the air as he sanded boards before dawn. The real estate agent was already waiting by the building when I arrived. A tall, thin man with the weary smile of someone who'd shown the same property too many times. "Mrs. Moore?" he asked, extending his hand. I nodded. "Call me Helen." He fumbled with the key ring, selecting one with chipped blue paint. "You're the first serious inquiry in months. Truth be told, this place needs someone with imagination." Imagination. Such an innocent word for what I needed. Resolve. When the door creaked open, the smell of dust and old wood drifted out. The interior was dim, lit only by the weak daylight spilling through gaps in the boarded windows. The floors were scuffed, the ceiling stained from an old leak. A battered counter stood near the entrance, half collapsed. A place people had abandoned long before I stepped inside. I ran my fingers along the counter's edge. My husband would have pressed his palm here, measuring its sturdiness. "It needs work," Martin said carefully, watching my reaction. "So do we all," I murmured. He hesitated, then continued. "The price is low because repairs will be substantial. Most buyers don't want that kind of responsibility." Responsibility. If only responsibility frightened me. I had carried it for decades, through bills, through illness, through raising a son who eventually outgrew his gratitude. While Martin spoke, my phone buzzed again. "David." "Mom?" "The director says you authorized premium embalming. That's pointless. We don't need the upgrades." Upgrades. As if preparing my husband's body were the same as choosing a car package. I silenced the phone and walked deeper into the room. Dust coated the shelves, but beneath it I could smell old pine, faint, stubborn, familiar. Something inside me softened, and for just a moment I imagined my husband standing beside me, his hands on his hips, assessing the place with quiet interest. "This is it," I whispered. "Pardon?" the agent asked. "This is the building I want." He blinked. "You're certain? Most people want to think a bit, compare options." "No," I said, turning toward him. "This is the one." He nodded slowly, pulling out his folder. "All right then, let's sit down and go through the paperwork." As we stepped outside to sign the preliminary forms, my phone buzzed again. "David, are you avoiding me? We need to be practical. Dad wouldn't want waste." I felt a strange calm settle over me. Not sharp bitterness, not hurt, just clarity. While Martin pointed out where I needed to initial, I glanced across the street. The funeral home sat quiet, blinds drawn. For years it had been a place I never truly saw. Today, it felt like a boundary line, one side belonging to who I had been, the other to who I was becoming. When the paperwork was done, Martin shook my hand. "Congratulations, Helen. You've bought yourself a project." "It's more than that," I said softly. On the walk home, a wind picked up, lifting loose hair from my collar. My phone buzzed a final time. "David, call me as soon as you get this." I didn't. For the first time in a long while, my silence felt like ownership. Of my choices, of my grief, of the life I still had left to shape. And as I reached my porch, I realized something simple and undeniable. My son's urgency no longer dictated the rhythm of my days. By the time I reached home, the wind had settled into one of those thin winter breezes that sneaks under your collar, reminding you you're still alive even when you feel more like a memory. I hung my coat by the door and stood there a moment, listening to the quiet. For years, silence in this house felt like abandonment. That day, it felt like room to think. I warmed yesterday's tea on the stove, though the flavor had gone stale. My husband used to tease me for drinking old tea, saying I treated it like a stubborn grief, warming it up instead of letting it go. I suppose he was right. I had barely sat down when the phone rang. Not a message this time. A call. David. I let it ring long enough to steady myself, then answered. "Mom," he said, breath quick, irritation already blooming. "Why aren't you responding? The director says you signed off on things we didn't discuss." "We didn't discuss anything, David," I said gently. "You discussed. I was dismissed." A pause. Sharp, defensive breathing. "I'm just trying to keep this manageable. Funerals get out of hand fast. You don't understand how people take advantage." "I understand enough." He huffed. "Well, I need you to hold off on any additional costs. We have to be realistic." There was that word again. Realistic. A word people use when they want you to shrink. "I'm doing what your father deserved," I replied. "Dad wouldn't want extravagance." "He would want dignity," I said. "The two aren't the same." He muttered something under his breath, too low for me to catch. "Anyway," he continued, "I need you to come by this afternoon so we can finalize the—" "I can't," I interrupted. "I have an appointment." "What appointment?" "It doesn't concern you." Another silence. This one brittle. "Mom, are you all right? You're acting strange." Strange. Not careful, not thoughtful. Strange. Old people become strange the moment their obedience slips. "I'm fine," I said. "I'll be at the funeral home tomorrow." "Not today." He started to protest, but I ended the call, placing the phone down slowly, deliberately. There was no triumph in it, just relief, like loosening laces that had been tied too tight for too long. The afternoon crept by in a pale wash of light. I found myself sorting through drawers, old receipts, faded recipe cards, loose screws my husband kept just in case. In the back of one drawer, I found a pencil of his, worn almost to a stub. I held it in my fingers. The wood was smooth from years of use, the graphite dulled. This little thing had shaped entire shelves, frames, toy boxes, an ordinary tool that had built a life. It would go with him, I decided, tucked inside his coat pocket at the viewing. Something small and true. Around 3, the funeral director called. "Mrs. Moore? Your son mentioned concerns about the embalming and the casket selection. I wanted to clarify your wishes personally." My son's concerns. His worries about the budget. His discomfort with me choosing anything beyond bare minimum. "My husband was a man of quiet craftsmanship," I said. "He made things to last. Please prepare him with the same care." The director's voice softened. "Of course." When I hung up, the house felt warmer. Or maybe I had simply stopped noticing the chill left behind by a lifetime of swallowing things that should have been spoken. Near dusk, I stepped outside. The sky was streaked with faint apricot light, the kind my husband used to call the merciful glow, the light that forgives the flaws in old buildings and old people. From the end of the street, I could see the funeral home's low brick silhouette. And right beside it, the narrow building I had stepped into that morning, its boarded windows now catching the last of the day. The wind carried the scent of damp earth. I breathed it in, slow and steady. Tomorrow, I would return to the funeral home. I would stand beside my husband's body, and I would hold my head high, even if my heart shook. For now, it was enough to feel the stirrings of something I had not known in years. Not rebellion, not anger, but the quiet, stubborn insistence of a life still mine to shape. The next morning, I woke before the light had fully settled over the rooftops. Age has a way of turning dawn into an old acquaintance. one who knocks whether you're ready or not. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs, feeling the weight of the day ahead settle across my shoulders like a familiar shawl. I dressed carefully, choosing a simple gray sweater and slacks. Nothing dramatic. I'd learned long ago that a woman my age doesn't need dramatic gestures. She needs steady ones. When I stepped outside, the air felt crisp enough to bite. On my walk toward town, my phone buzzed. David, we need to talk before you go back to the funeral home. There are decisions pending. Decisions. He always did love making them for everyone else. I slipped the phone into my coat pocket without answering and kept walking. The building I now had under contract appeared at the end of the block, its narrow silhouette pressed against the winter light. Even with its sagging roofline and boarded windows, it stirred something that felt like warmth beneath my ribs. Not joy exactly, too soon for joy, but recognition. As if some long-buried part of me had taken a step forward. Martin, the agent, met me inside with a stack of papers neatly clipped together. Morning, Helen. I've got the preliminary repair estimates, zoning notes, and seller disclosures. He laid them on the counter, half collapsed, dust-furred, but still sturdy enough to bear the weight of expectation. I brushed my fingers across the papers. Contracts, numbers, decisions without anyone hovering over me, insisting I was fragile. This is the cost if you want to keep the original bones, he said, tapping a page. It's more work, but the structure is good. Surprisingly so. Good, I murmured. He always preferred things built to last. Your husband? He asked gently. I nodded. He didn't press. Kindness often looks like restraint. As he stepped aside to take a call, I wandered toward the back of the building. The floorboards creaked under me. Honest creaks, not deceitful ones. I ran my hand along the wall, touching the gritty paint. I imagined the space cleaned out, sunlight spilling through open windows, the air warm with sawdust and conversation. A place where things could be made, not merely lost. My phone buzzed again. David, answer me. We need to lock in decisions today. Don't complicate things. I turned the phone face down on a dusty shelf. Let it buzz itself empty. When Martin finished his call, he joined me at the back doorway, where a sliver of light slipped through the cracks. Do you want to move forward with the full inspection? He asked. Yes, I said. And the structural engineer as well. My husband always said foundations matter. A small smile tugged at his mouth. They do. Outside, a car slowed. Not many people came down this side street. The window lowered, and a familiar voice called out, tight with irritation. Mom? David. He parked crookedly, slammed the door, and strode toward us with the stiff, hasty steps of a man who feels control slipping. What are you doing here? He demanded, glancing from me to the building as if both of us had betrayed him. I'm attending to something, I said. Something? Mom, Dad's funeral is tomorrow. We have decisions to finalize. And you're wandering around. Here? He said here, like it was a junkyard. Like anything not in his plan was waste. I'm not wandering, I replied calmly. He looked at the papers in my hand and frowned. Are you buying this place? Is that why you haven't answered me? You can't make big decisions alone right now. You're not thinking clearly. I felt a quietness settle inside me. Not the weak kind, the rooted kind. David, I said softly, I've been making decisions alone my entire life. You just never noticed. He blinked, caught off guard. Before he could recover, Martin stepped forward politely. Your mother has signed preliminary documents. She's perfectly capable. David shot him a look sharp enough to cut. This is family business. No, I said. This is my business. The wind shifted, brushing my cheek with its cold edge. My husband used to say that winter air tells the truth better than people do. It certainly did now. David exhaled hard, shaking his head. Fine, but don't expect me to clean up whatever mess this becomes. We can't afford distractions. Not right now. I met his eyes. I'm not the distraction. He didn't answer, just turned, jaw tight, and walked back to his car. When he drove away, the street fell quiet again. Martin cleared his throat gently. Well, should we continue? Yes, I said, stepping back inside the building. Let's. And as I crossed the threshold, I realized the truth with a clarity that warmed me against the cold. My son believed he was losing control. What he didn't understand was that I had never belonged to his control in the first place. The morning of the funeral arrived with a pale, washed-out sky, the kind that feels neither like a blessing nor a threat, simply a fact of the world. I moved slowly, not out of fragility, but because there is something solemn about preparing yourself to see the body of the person who held your life together for half a century. Every gesture feels weighted. Even buttoning a coat becomes a small ceremony. I arrived early, before the rest of the family. The funeral home was quiet, still carrying the faint antiseptic smell I remembered from the day before. A young attendant nodded to me and opened the viewing room door. My husband lay there, dressed in his best suit, the one he wore to our granddaughter's graduation. His hair was combed neatly, his hands folded over his chest. They looked too still. Those hands had never been still in life, always repairing, building, fixing what the world broke. I walked toward him, my steps echoing softly in the empty room. The air felt heavier here, though not oppressive. More like a thick blanket you have to push through. I touched the edge of the casket, then reached into my purse and took out the pencil, the small, worn one I had found in the drawer. I slid it gently beneath his folded hands. You don't go anywhere empty-handed, I whispered. The room stayed quiet, but something in me settled. I heard the door open behind me. Slow footsteps. I didn't turn. Mom, David said. His voice was softer than yesterday, but not softened, just drained. Why didn't you wait for us? This moment wasn't for you, I answered. He sighed, a tight, impatient sound. We still need to finalize the order of service. And the flowers. The director said you requested upgrades without consulting me. I didn't realize your approval was required, I said. He stepped closer, lowering his voice as if the dead could be disturbed. Mom, I'm trying to keep things reasonable. I kept my eyes on my husband's face. Reasonable is not the same as respectful. David rubbed his forehead. We're spending money we don't have. You mean money you don't want to spend, I corrected gently. He tensed at that, but before he could argue, the door opened again and guests began entering. Neighbors, old co-workers, distant cousins. Their murmurs filled the corners of the room. Condolences drifted toward me like thin threads, each one tugging a little at my composure. I nodded, accepting them quietly. I had never been one for theatrics, grief included. When the service began, I took my seat in the front row. David sat beside me, stiff, checking his phone more than once, even here, even now. His wife whispered something to him about seating arrangements, about the reception, about timing. I watched the officiant speak, watched people dab at their eyes. Watched the man I had loved become a memory everyone else would leave behind once the hour was done. But I stayed steady. The casket was carried out, and the crowd began to file toward their cars. David leaned close. "I'll meet you at the gravesite. Try not to make this harder than it has to be." Harder, as if grief were a negotiation. I stood outside, letting the cold air fill my lungs. Across the street, just beyond the line of traffic, the narrow building waited, still boarded, still wore down, still unmistakably his dream. I felt the ache of loss sharpen, then widen, stretching into something larger than sorrow. Tomorrow, the grave would be filled. But something in my life had just been unburied. The graveside service was brief, the kind of ceremony people rush through when the cold starts creeping into their shoes. I listened, but the words slid over me like water over stone. Kind phrases, practiced condolences, nothing that spoke to the man who once carved my initials into the underside of our dining table, just to make me laugh. Grief makes you remember the small things, not the grand ones. After the final prayer, people left in slow clumps, heading toward their warm cars, their warm homes, their warm dinners. David stayed behind, pacing near the headstone, his face tight. "Mom," he said finally, "we need to talk." I didn't answer right away. I watched the workers stand at a respectful distance, waiting for us to finish before lowering the casket. My husband would be underground in minutes, dirt covering decades of our life. And still, my son's voice sounded impatient. "What is it?" I asked, not unkindly. "This..." He gestured vaguely at everything. "All of this was harder than it needed to be. You made it complicated." I turned to look at him fully. His eyes were red, not from crying, but from exhaustion, frustration, the kind of strain a man feels when the world refuses to fold neatly under his control. "You say complicated," I replied, "but what you mean is not your way." He exhaled sharply. "Mom, for God's sake, I'm trying to help you. You're not thinking straight. Dad didn't care about fancy funerals. He cared about saving money, about being practical." "Your father cared about dignity," I said quietly, "even when he had none to spare." David rubbed his face, pacing again. His voice cracked with irritation, not grief. "I can't be managing your decisions on top of everything else. I have a family, responsibilities, bills." There it was, the familiar refrain. His burdens stacked neatly above mine in his mind, as if my needs existed solely to be measured against his convenience. He stepped closer. "You have to stop spending recklessly. The embalming, the casket upgrades. Mom, we can't afford this." "I can," I said. "That's not the point." "It is," I replied simply. He stared at me, thrown off by my calm. He wasn't used to me being steady. He was used to me bending, softening, accommodating. "Look," he said, lowering his voice, "just promise me you won't make any major decisions for a while. Not until things settle." "I already have," I said. "What decision?" His eyes narrowed. I didn't answer. Some truths are not owed in the heat of anger. "You're being secretive," he said. "And honestly, irrational. What are you doing? What's going on with you?" I looked past him to the casket suspended above the earth, the ropes taut, the workers waiting. The wind tugged at my coat. I felt the weight of the moment, not just his father being lowered into the ground, but the realization that our relationship had been buried long before this day. "I'm taking care of myself," I said softly. "Something I should have done a long time ago." That doesn't make any sense, he snapped. You're being dramatic. You need guidance right now, not independence. Independence. At 76, my own son thought the word didn't belong to me anymore. I need peace, I corrected. He opened his mouth again, but I lifted a hand. David, please. Let your father be lowered. My voice was steady enough that he stepped back. We stood there as the workers began the slow descent. The ropes creaked. The coffin sank inch by inch. David kept glancing at his watch, shifting his weight. I kept my eyes on the lowering casket until it disappeared from sight. When it was done, when the last clump of soil thudded into place, I whispered a goodbye that no one else heard. David cleared his throat. You're coming to the reception? No, I said. I'm going home. He blinked. But people expect. I don't live for expectations anymore. He stared at me, as if seeing a stranger. Maybe he was. I walked toward my car, each step firm, deliberate. Behind me, I heard him call my name, frustrated, confused, unprepared for a mother who no longer moved on the strings he held. I didn't turn back. The earth had closed over my husband. Something in me had closed too, and something else had quietly begun to open. The day after the burial, I woke with a strange, quiet clarity. Grief still lived inside me. I could feel it in the hollowness behind my ribs, but it no longer felt like an anchor. More like a curtain pulled back from something I had been too tired to face for years. I moved slowly through the house, aware of every creak, every old familiar sound, as if the walls were waiting to see what I would do next. I sat at the kitchen table with a notepad and a pen. My husband used to say that every problem becomes smaller once it's written down. I wasn't solving a problem, though. I was reclaiming a life. The lawyer's office was on the other side of town, a modest little building tucked between a bakery and a hardware store. I'd walked past it hundreds of times without noticing it. Strange how a woman can pass by the tools she needs until the moment she finally reaches for them. Inside, the receptionist recognized me at once. Grief softens people toward you. They speak gently, as if even their words might bruise. Mrs. Moore, Mr. Lanson will see you shortly. His office was warm, lined with shelves of worn books and little brass figurines. He looked older than I remembered, or maybe I was just seeing him with new eyes. Helen, he said, rising to shake my hand. I'm truly sorry about your husband. Thank you, I replied. I'm here because I need to make some changes. He nodded, as if he had expected this. Grief brings out a certain decisiveness in people, he once told me. When the foundation shifts, people realize what is no longer acceptable. I handed him my notes. I want to update my will, I said, and I want to establish protections for my assets going forward. He read quietly for a moment. You want to remove your son as primary beneficiary? Yes. And instead leave the woodworking building you're purchasing, the remaining funds, and your savings to a trust? Yes. He adjusted his glasses. Any particular trustee? My niece, Margaret, I said. She's steady. She shows up, and she doesn't ask for anything. He made a soft sound of approval. And your son? I paused. He'll receive one thing, my husband's toolbox. The lawyer looked at me carefully, not judging, not prying, simply understanding more than I said aloud. That's a clear message, Helen. It's the truth, I answered. He valued my husband's labor, but not his life. Let him hold the weight of those tools and decide what to make of it. We spent an hour going through papers, Legal language, clauses, signatures. I listened closely, asked questions, repeated details to be sure I understood. It felt good to understand. It felt good to speak without interruption. When it was done, he leaned back. I'll finalize the documents this week. Everything will be protected. No one can touch your accounts without explicit consent. Good, I said. That's the point. As I stood to leave, he hesitated. Helen, you're making these choices with a clear mind, but be prepared. When your son finds out, he may not react gently. I know, I said. I've prepared for that too. Outside, the late afternoon light had softened into a muted gold. The bakery next door smelled of warm sugar and cinnamon. I stood there a moment, breathing it in, feeling the steadiness return to my spine. For the first time in a long while, my decisions felt like mine, not reactive, not desperate, not apologetic. On my walk home, I passed the funeral home. The windows were dark, the curtains drawn. Across from it stood the narrow brick building I was now tied to in ways deeper than paperwork. The boards on the windows caught the fading light like tired eyelids. I paused on the sidewalk, hands in my pockets, and let the quiet settle. The dead are buried, but the living, if we choose to, can still rise. The first day I returned to the building after visiting the lawyer, the air inside felt different. Not warmer, not brighter, but expectant, as if the walls themselves were waiting to see what I would do next. Dust still coated every surface. The floor still groaned beneath my steps, but I no longer felt like a visitor. The key in my pocket made that clear enough. I walked slowly through the space, imagining possibilities the way one imagines furniture in an empty room, tentative at first, then with increasing boldness. My husband always said that creation begins in the mind long before it reaches the hands. Maybe that was true for old women, too. A contractor arrived mid-morning, a stocky man with kind eyes and paint on his boots. "Mrs. Moore?" he asked, glancing around as though he couldn't reconcile my age with the ambition of purchasing such a place. "Yes," I said, offering my hand. "Call me Helen." He smiled. "Heard you want to revive this building." "I want to give it purpose," I corrected gently. "It's waited long enough." We walked through the rooms together. He pointed out water damage, structural needs, electrical concerns. Nothing he said frightened me. Problems, when spoken aloud plainly, lose half their power. Besides, I had lived through bigger collapses than anything these walls had endured. "What do you want this place to become?" he asked finally. I hesitated, not because I didn't know, but because saying it aloud felt like peeling away a protective layer. "A workshop," I said quietly. "A place where people can make things, repair things, learn to use their hands. My husband wanted something like that." The contractor nodded slowly. "A community space?" "Yes," I said. "Open to anyone who needs a place to build instead of break." He scratched his beard thoughtfully. "I've seen worse buildings come back to life. This one's got a good spine." Good spine. I almost smiled. Age teaches you to appreciate anything with a spine. We discussed timelines, repairs, costs. He explained each step clearly, never condescending, never speaking as though my years made me fragile. That alone felt like a gift. When he left, promising to send a formal estimate by evening, I stayed behind, hearing the faint echo of the door closing. The quiet that settled after his departure felt different from the quiet in my house. This was not absence. This was potential. I walked to the far wall, where a patch of sunlight seeped through a crack in the boarded window. Dust floated in the beam, shimmering faintly. I reached into my purse and pulled out my husband's old work apron. Frayed, stained, the straps softened by time. I had brought it with me without really deciding to. Some gestures live already formed somewhere inside us. I hung it on a nail in the wall, a simple act. But the moment it settled there, the building felt less empty. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. I didn't need to look to know who it was. David had called 3 times earlier and left messages that alternated between clipped irritation and strained patience. I hadn't listened to them. Not because I wished to punish him, but because his voice had become a door I finally understood how to close. Instead, I walked to the doorway and looked out toward the street. Cars passed. People moved about their lives, unaware of the small shift happening inside this dusty rectangle of brick. But I felt it, a subtle, steadying pulse under my skin. This place would take months to restore, maybe longer. My hands would not do the heaviest work, but they would guide it. And for the first time in decades, I had something to guide that belonged entirely to me. Before leaving, I ran my hand along the windowsill, leaving a small, visible streak where dust gave way to the wood beneath. Some things reveal their worth only when someone finally touches them with intention. I locked the door behind me and stepped into the cold afternoon light, feeling the weight of my husband's apron still hanging inside. A promise returned to the air. 3 days passed before David finally appeared in person. I wasn't surprised. Anger has a way of gathering weight until it needs a body to carry it. He didn't call ahead. He never did when he wanted control more than conversation. I was at the building when he arrived, standing near the back wall while the contractor's crew took measurements. The sound of tape snapping and pencils scratching on clipboards filled the air. A strange kind of music, steady and patient. It soothed me. Then the front door slammed. "Helen?" one of the workers called. "Someone's looking for you." Not Mom. Helen. I walked toward the entrance, brushing plaster dust from my sweater. David stood near the threshold, his jaw tight, his eyes darting around the exposed beams and sagging drywall as if he had stumbled into a crime scene. "Mom," he said, his voice sharp, "what is going on?" "I'm renovating," I replied calmly. "You bought this?" His voice rose, incredulous. "This dump?" The workers glanced at him briefly, then returned to their tasks. Men who understood decay and restoration seldom judged what a place used to be. I stepped aside to let David in. "It has good bones." "I don't care about its bones," he snapped. "I care about you making reckless decisions when you're vulnerable." I felt the shift before he said the word. Vulnerable. A soft, patronizing wound disguised as concern. "I'm not vulnerable," I said. "You just buried your husband. You're emotional. You're not thinking clearly." Anger might have flared once, years ago. But now there was only steadiness, the kind that grows slowly after too much bending. "I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years," I said. He ran a hand through his hair. "I talked to your bank. They said you moved funds. Significant funds. Mom, this is irresponsible." "You spoke to my bank?" I asked quietly. "They called me." "No," I interrupted. "They wouldn't have called you. Not unless you've been trying to handle my accounts." His silence answered for him. The same silence that had hung between us at the graveside. The same silence that revealed more than his carefully chosen words. I folded my hands. I updated my legal documents. He blinked. "What documents?" "My will, my accounts. Everything." His voice dropped to a harsh whisper. Without consulting me? I felt something in my chest uncoil, gently but firmly. It was not yours to be consulted on. He swallowed hard. So what? What did you do? I didn't want to wound him, but truth has its own contour, and sometimes it cuts regardless. I placed everything into a protected trust, I said. My niece will oversee it when the time comes. What? The word came out strangled. Why her? Why not me? Because you stopped showing up. Because you started taking. Because love without regard becomes expectation. But I didn't say any of that. I simply met his gaze and said, because she listens. His face hardened. So that's it? You're punishing me? No, I said softly. I'm protecting myself. He laughed once, short, bitter. And what do I get? Nothing. After everything I've done. I reached into my bag and pulled out the small wooden box I had prepared the night before. I placed it in his hands. He opened it, confusion flickering across his face. Inside was his father's toolbox, well-worn, polished by decades of use. That is your inheritance, I said. Something real, something honest. He stared at it, stunned. Then anger flooded in to replace shock. You can't be serious. I am. He closed the lid sharply. You'll regret this. You're making decisions you don't understand. I understand perfectly, I said. For the first time, maybe. Behind us, a saw buzzed to life, steady, purposeful. The sound filled the air like a reminder that creation continues, even while arguments break apart. David took a step back, the box still in his hands, his face twisted with a hurt he didn't know how to express without turning it into rage. This isn't over, he said finally. But for me, it was. He walked out, the door slamming again, though not as hard as before. The building absorbed the echo, and I breathed easier in its wake. I didn't expect David to return the next day, but grief has a way of pushing people back toward what they fear losing. He arrived just before noon, when the workers were out for lunch and the building was quiet. His car door shut gently this time, not slammed. That alone told me something had shifted in him. Anger had cooled into something heavier. He stepped inside slowly, looking smaller than he had the day before, though his shoulders were still tight. I stood near the back wall, sorting through sample tiles the contractor had left for me to consider. I didn't turn immediately. Some conversations breathe better when no one rushes them. Mom, he said at last. Not sharp, not impatient, just tired. I set a tile down. Hello, David. He looked around the space as though seeing it for the first time, the exposed beams, the dust, the light filtering through cracks in the boards. Why this place? He asked. There was no accusation in the question, only a quiet bewilderment. Your father wanted it, I said, and I need something that belongs to me. He let out a slow breath. You blindsided me yesterday. No, I replied gently. You assumed I wouldn't act without your permission. He flinched just slightly. I didn't mean it like that. For years, I continued, you made decisions for me, some with good intentions, some out of convenience, and I let you. That was my mistake. He rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture I remembered from when he was a boy, caught doing something he knew was wrong. I thought you needed help. I needed respect, I said. There's a difference. Silence eased into the room. He set the wooden box, the toolbox, on a nearby counter. He must have brought it back for the conversation, though he didn't open it. Is this really all I get? He asked. You get what your father left you, I said. Something honest, something he touched with his own hands. His voice cracked around the edges. I didn't expect nothing. It isn't nothing, I said softly. But it isn't money. Money was what you expected. He swallowed hard. You think I'm selfish? I think, I said carefully, that somewhere along the way, you forgot that parents are people, not resources to be managed, not problems to be minimized. People. He looked down at his shoes. I didn't realize you felt that way. No, I said. You didn't ask. His eyes lifted then, filled with something more vulnerable than I'd seen in years. Regret, maybe. Or the first shape of it. I suppose I didn't, he admitted. I walked toward the window, brushing a finger along the dusty sill. Your father and I built a life with very little. We gave freely because that's what love meant to us. But giving isn't the same as being taken for granted. You didn't notice when the giving stopped being mutual. He winced. I've been busy. Work. The kids. Life. Life, I repeated softly. We all have it, David. Even old women. He closed his eyes at that. When he opened them again, I saw something clear, though painful, settle in his expression. What do you want from me? He asked. What do you need? Nothing, I said. And that is the point. I am not asking for anything. I am not demanding anything. I'm simply choosing myself. You may not understand that, but you must accept it. He looked toward the apron hanging on the wall, the one that had belonged to his father. Something softened in his posture, just slightly. You're really doing this place? He asked quietly. Yes. He nodded once, slowly. I don't agree with your decisions, but I see you're serious. I am. A long breath left him. Not surrender, not peace. Something in between. He picked up the wooden box and held it carefully, this time, not angrily. I'll think about this, he said. That's all I expect. He walked toward the door, pausing briefly before stepping out. Mom, he said without turning, I'm not good at whatever this is. I know, I said gently. And he left. The room settled around me again, quiet and whole. Some confrontations end with raised voices. The meaningful ones end with truth spoken plainly, left to echo until someone is finally ready to hear it. The first warm day of early spring arrived almost shyly, as if unsure it had permission to settle in. Sunlight touched the tops of the buildings with a pale gold, and for the first time in months, the air lost its sharp edges. I unlocked the door to the workshop, my workshop now, and stepped inside. The smell hit me first. Not the musty odor of disuse that had clung to the building when I first entered, but the bright, living scent of freshly cut wood. The contractors had cleared the debris, sanded the floors, opened the boarded windows. Light pooled across the room in long, gentle beams. The building was not finished yet, but it had exhaled. It had opened its eyes. I walked slowly through the space, the newness mingling with what had always been here. The walls still held scars from their decades of neglect, but the scars no longer felt like wounds. They felt like history. The workers arrived in small bursts of noise, boots against the floor, toolboxes clattering. They greeted me warmly now, without surprise. I suppose they had begun to understand that I belonged here, even if my age suggested otherwise. Good morning, Helen, one of them said, as he set down a stack of lumber. We'll start on the shelving today. Should look beautiful once it's stained. Make it sturdy, I said. He liked things that lasted. We know, he smiled. I walked to the apron hanging on the wall, my husband's apron, the fabric worn soft from years of use. It didn't hurt to touch it anymore. The ache was still there, but it had transformed into something gentler, something like gratitude. Outside, cars passed in a slow trickle. People went about their days unaware of the quiet reclamation taking place inside this thin rectangle of brick. I didn't need them to know. I didn't need anyone's permission or applause. The act itself was enough. By afternoon, the contractor called me over to see the progress. Shelves were going up, thick, strong planks along the back wall. The light caught the grain of the wood, revealing lines that reminded me of age rings in a tree. Years measured not in failures, but in endurance. "This space will hold," he said, stepping back to admire their work. "So will I murmured. He didn't hear me. That was all right. Not every truth needs an audience. While they worked, I brewed tea on a small portable kettle I kept near the door. The steam drifted through the room, curling into the smell of sawdust and varnish. It reminded me of a long ago morning when my husband and I painted the kitchen together, the windows open, the radio buzzing faintly in the background. Funny how the senses remember happiness, even when the heart grieves. Around 3 o'clock, a soft knock sounded at the door. Not a customer. We weren't open yet. Not a worker. They never knocked. I turned, wiping my hands on my sweater. It was Margaret, my niece. She stood holding a small cardboard box and wearing the same gentle half-smile she'd had since childhood. "Aunt Helen," she said, "I brought you those sanding blocks you asked about. Thought I'd drop them off." Her presence felt easy, natural. She didn't look around with judgment or confusion, only curiosity. "It's coming along beautifully," she said, stepping inside. "It feels peaceful." "It does," I agreed. She placed the box on a work table. "I'm proud of you." The words landed softly, but they reached places inside me that had gone untouched for years. Respect, given freely, has a different temperature. Warm, steady, without demand. We spent a few minutes talking. Simple, ordinary talk. The kind that doesn't drain a person, but fills them. After she left, I stood by the open windows, listening to the murmur of the workers finishing their tasks. The day had stretched long, but not heavy. For the first time in a long while, I felt aligned with my own life rather than misaligned inside someone else's expectations. The light began to fade, slipping across the floorboards in long amber streaks. Tomorrow, more shelves would go up. Soon, the doors would open. Not for profit, not for revenge, but for purpose. And in that quiet, golden hour, I understood with a clarity that steadied me. I was no longer rebuilding a building. I was rebuilding myself. The day we opened the doors of the workshop, the sky was clear in that unassuming way early spring skies often are. Blue, without insisting on being admired. Light poured through the newly installed windows, settling gently across the long tables and clean shelves. The building smelled of fresh pine and possibility. A handful of people drifted in, mostly neighbors, a few curious passers-by, 2 retired men who had heard there might be tools and company. They moved slowly, respectfully, as if entering a place already rich with memory. One of them paused at my husband's apron on the wall. "He worked with his hands?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "He made useful things." "Good man, then." I nodded. I didn't have to say more. Soon the room filled with the low, familiar music of creation. Sandpaper rasping, soft conversation, the rhythmic tap of tools against wood. Nothing loud, nothing urgent. just the presence of living people shaping something from nothing. It felt like breathing fresh air after years of holding it in. I sat on a small stool near the back wall, letting the moment wash over me. This place wasn't grand. It wasn't profitable. But it was honest. It was mine. And it honored a man who had spent his life building without applause. Around midday, Margaret arrived again, carrying a thermos and a paper bag. "Lunch," she said. "I figured you probably forgot to eat." She knew me well. I accepted the bag with a grateful smile. Her presence didn't crowd the space. She didn't fuss, didn't question. She simply fit into the room the way a steady beam fits into a structure. Quiet support, unspoken strength. At some point, I noticed David standing outside on the sidewalk. He didn't come in. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, watching. His anger had cooled entirely now, replaced by something I recognized but didn't name. He lifted his hand in a small, uncertain wave. I returned it. Nothing more needed to be said. Not today. Some distances can be bridged only slowly, if they're meant to be bridged at all. When he walked away, I didn't feel triumph or sorrow. Only peace. Later, when the room emptied and the sun dipped low across the floorboards, I swept the sawdust into a neat pile. My hands trembled a little. Age reminds me of itself. But the trembling did not bother me. Every life leaves its marks. I sat again on the stool, listening to the building settle in the evening quiet. A long breath moved through me, steady as a tide. I thought of my husband. I thought of the years I spent shrinking myself to keep the peace. I thought of the moment I realized I could choose a different kind of life, even at 76. Freedom doesn't always arrive with a roar. Sometimes it enters softly, like a woman opening the door of an old building and deciding to step inside. I traced a fingertip along the grain of the nearest table, feeling the steady pulse of purpose beneath it. This place did not fix everything. It didn't heal every wound or rewrite every loss. But it returned something I had not felt in decades, my own dignity, warm and solid in my hands. And if you are reading this, if you have lived years bending yourself into smaller shapes for the comfort of others, let me offer you this. You are not done. You are not used up. You are not too late. Take one quiet step toward yourself. A small one is enough. Life has a way of opening doors the moment you stop waiting for someone else to turn the handle.
H1. Wait. Hold on, stop the presses. I just read this title and I am deceased. Pun fully intended. My son told the funeral director to keep it cheap. I bought the building next door. This is legendary. This is iconic. This is the most savage power move I have ever heard of in my entire life. This is someone who was planning their own funeral, or whose funeral was being planned while they were still alive and aware. Hearing their own son tell the funeral director to keep it cheap, and then responding by purchasing the building next door to the funeral home. The absolute audacity. The brilliance, the pettiness elevated to an art form. I am living for this energy. Let me break this down word by word, because every single part of this title is loaded with implications, drama, and the sweetest revenge I've ever witnessed. My son, your own child, the person you raised, the person you sacrificed for, provided for, loved unconditionally for decades. The person who's supposed to honor and respect you, especially when it comes to something as significant as your funeral. That's who we're talking about here. Told the funeral director. So this is real. This isn't just casual conversation. The son is in an actual meeting with an actual funeral director, discussing funeral arrangements. This is happening in a professional setting, where serious decisions are being made about someone's final arrangements. This is supposed to be a moment of reverence, respect, and honoring the deceased. But instead, to keep it cheap. Those words. Keep it cheap. Not we need to be mindful of the budget. Not let's find reasonable options. Not what's practical. But keep it cheap. That's disrespectful language. That's treating your parents' funeral like a transaction, where the goal is to spend as little money as possible. That's viewing the funeral not as a final tribute to someone you love, but as an expense to minimize. And the fact that he's saying this to the funeral director, a professional who's probably heard all kinds of family dynamics, but this has got to be near the top of the disrespectful things they've witnessed, shows he has no shame about it. He's not even trying to be subtle or diplomatic. He's just openly stating that he wants the bare minimum for his parents' funeral. That's cold. Now here's where it gets absolutely wild. I bought the building next door. The parent, who was presumably dying or thought to be near death, heard what the son said, and instead of just being hurt or accepting it or confronting him emotionally, they did something spectacular. They bought real estate. Specifically, they bought the building next door to the funeral home. Let me emphasize the implications of this move. First, it means the parent is not dead, obviously, because dead people can't buy buildings. So either the son was planning a funeral prematurely, which is weird, but happens with terminal illnesses, or he was planning it while the parent was still alive and expected to die soon. Either way, he's discussing funeral arrangements while his parent is still alive. That alone is pretty morbid. Second, the parent heard what the son said. Maybe they were in the room, but the son didn't realize they were listening. Maybe someone told them about it. Maybe they overheard through a wall or door. However they found out, they learned that their son wanted to keep it cheap for their funeral. That's devastating knowledge. Third, instead of just being hurt, the parent had the resources and wherewithal to purchase a building. Not a car, not a vacation, a building. That's significant financial capability. That's having enough money and clarity of mind to execute a major real estate transaction. That tells me this parent is not only alive, but sharp, capable, and wealthy enough to make serious power moves. Fourth, they specifically bought the building next door to the funeral home. Not a building across town, not just any building, the one next door. That's strategic. That's intentional. That's making sure the son and the funeral home know exactly what this purchase is about. It's a statement. It's a message. It's wielding financial power in the most pointed way possible. But what is the message? What does buying the building next door accomplish? Let me speculate on the brilliant possibilities. Possibility 1. Financial leverage. The parent now owns property adjacent to the funeral home. That gives them leverage. They could lease the space to a competitor funeral home. Use it for a business that complements the funeral home. Use it for a business that competes with or undermines the funeral home. Simply own it and let the funeral home know they're being watched. Have a say in what happens in that location. Possibility 2. Public statement. By buying the building next door, the parent is making a visible statement of their financial capacity. The son wanted to keep it cheap because he presumably thought money was limited or should be conserved. but the parent just demonstrated they have enough money to buy a building. That completely undermines the son's narrative. It says, "You thought I was poor, or that you needed to conserve my money. Look at what I can actually afford." Possibility 3. Inheritance control. Here's where it gets really interesting. The son wanted a cheap funeral, probably to conserve the inheritance. He's thinking about his future money. He doesn't want his money, the inheritance he expects, spent on an expensive funeral. But by buying a building, spending a significant amount of money, the parent is demonstrating that they control their own assets and can spend them however they want. The son doesn't get to dictate how the parent's money is used. And if the parent wants to reduce the inheritance by buying real estate, that's their right. Possibility 4. Ultimate pettiness. The parent now owns the building next to the funeral home where their son tried to arrange a cheap funeral. Every time the son drives by, every time he has to go back to that funeral home for any reason, he'll be reminded of his disrespect and his father's response. That's creating a permanent physical monument to his failure and his power. That's next-level pettiness. Possibility 5. Future planning. Maybe the parent is planning their own funeral now, one that's not cheap, and having control of the adjacent building gives them leverage or options for how their funeral is actually handled. Or maybe they're ensuring that if the son tries to go cheap again, they have resources and location nearby to intervene. Let me talk about what "keep it cheap" actually means in a funeral context, because this is important. Funerals can range from a few $1,000s for very basic services to tens of thousands for elaborate arrangements. When someone says "keep it cheap," they usually mean the most basic casket or even a cardboard container if cremation, no embalming or minimal preparation, no viewing or visitation hours, minimal or no flowers, basic obituary or none at all, graveside service only, no funeral home service, cheapest burial plot or cremation, no reception or gathering afterward, minimal ceremony. Essentially, they want the bare legal minimum required to dispose of a body. That's what "keep it cheap" translates to. And hearing your son request that for you, that he wants the bare minimum spent on your final farewell, that's crushing. That tells you that you're not valued, that your life isn't worth commemorating, that saving money is more important than honoring your memory. And for what? To preserve the inheritance. That's usually what this comes down to. The son is thinking, every dollar spent on the funeral is a dollar I don't inherit. He's viewing his parents' funeral as an expense that comes out of his future money. That's greedy. That's viewing your parent as a financial asset rather than a human being you love and want to honor. But here's the beautiful irony. By buying a building, the parent just spent potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars. That's money that won't be part of the inheritance. The son wanted to save money on the funeral, to maximize his inheritance. But his request triggered the parent to make a massive purchase that reduces the inheritance far more than any expensive funeral would have. That's consequences. That's the universe delivering justice. That's the parent saying, "You wanted to control my money. Watch me spend it in ways that serve me, not your future inheritance plans." That's taking power back. Now let's talk about the son's perspective, because I want to understand what could lead someone to this level of disrespect. Maybe he's financially struggling and genuinely can't afford an expensive funeral. But if that's the case, he should be honest about it. "Dad, Mom, I want to honor you, but I'm financially stretched. Can we discuss affordable options that still show respect? That's very different from keep it cheap. Maybe he's greedy and views the inheritance as his money that's being wasted on a funeral. But that reveals a fundamental character flaw, valuing money over honoring your parent. That's prioritizing your own financial benefit over your parent's dignity. Maybe there's family conflict, and he's angry at the parent for some reason. But even if there's legitimate grievance, you don't disrespect someone's funeral. You don't diminish their final farewell because you're mad at them. That's using death as an opportunity for revenge, which is despicable. Maybe he's just thoughtless and doesn't understand how hurtful keep it cheap sounds. But even that reveals a lack of empathy and respect. When you're planning someone's funeral, you should be thoughtful and considerate, not casually dismissive. None of these explanations justify what he said. At best, he's thoughtless and insensitive. At worst, he's greedy and cruel. And either way, he's now facing consequences for his words. Let me talk about the parents' emotional journey here, because it must have been intense. First, there's the shock of hearing those words. Keep it cheap. Your own son, reducing your entire life, your entire legacy, your final farewell to a budget concern. That's got to feel like a punch to the gut. Then there's the hurt. The deep, profound pain of realizing your child doesn't value you enough to want a dignified funeral for you. The realization that to him, you're just an expense to be minimized. That has to cut deep. Then probably comes anger. Righteous, justified fury at the disrespect. How dare he? After everything you've done for him, after all the sacrifices and love and support, this is how he values you? That anger is fuel. And then, and this is where it gets brilliant, comes strategic thinking. Instead of just reacting emotionally, the parent channels that anger into action. You think I'm just a budget line item? Let me show you what I'm actually capable of. Let me demonstrate my power and resources in a way you can't ignore. Buying the building next door is calculated. It's not impulsive revenge. It's thoughtful, strategic, powerful response. It requires having significant financial resources, finding out the building is available, negotiating the purchase, going through the legal process, completing the transaction. That's not something you do in a moment of anger. That's something you plan. And that planning shows intelligence and capability that completely contradicts the son's apparent view of his parent as someone whose funeral should be kept cheap. Now let's think about when the son finds out about this purchase. How does he learn his parent bought the building next door to the funeral home? Does the parent tell him directly? Oh, by the way, I heard you wanted to keep my funeral cheap, so I bought the building next door to the funeral home. Just thought you should know. That delivery would be iconic. The casualness, the matter-of-fact tone, the complete power move disguised as neutral information sharing. The son would be reeling. You what? You bought how? Why? Or does he find out indirectly? Maybe through property records. Maybe someone else tells him. Maybe he sees the parent's name on the building. However he finds out, the shock must be enormous. Not just that his parent made this purchase, but what it means. It means his parent is more capable than he thought. It means his parent has more money than he assumed. It means his parent heard what he said and was offended enough to respond with this power move. And it means the inheritance just got smaller. By a lot. Whatever that building cost, that's money that's not going to be inherited. The son's attempt to save money on the funeral just cost him far more in inheritance reduction. That's karma in mathematical form. Period, 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 period.